on Washington Avenue here in St. Louis. And every time they talk about the tech startups, LockerDome is at the top of the list as one of the great new startup inventions and great new companies here in St. Louis. Gabe Lozano, CEO and founder of LockerDome, joins us here in the studio. Gabe, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you had an employee shot and killed.
We did.
What happened?
So he was over in the Central West End, hanging out with some friends, walking down over near Olive and Walton. A couple individuals jumped out of a car, tried to rob him, ended up shooting him once in the chest, once in the back, and he died in and around that intersection.
And this happened last week?
This happened last week.
You've decided to, as LockerDome is reeling from the loss, as any company would be of the loss, you guys are a tight-knit, small business. You work very closely together. You work hard, a lot of hours together. You're probably best of friends. You've decided to ring the bell, if you will, and sort of call attention to the crime that is going on in St. Louis.
Part of the discussion wasn't just around this incident. So Tyrell Thompson is the individual that lost his life. Incredibly talented young man, great young man. But it was actually the day before that, I was in a room with a number of leaders in St. Louis who were talking about everything going on in St. Louis. So they're trying to look at economically, socially, crime-wise, are we doing a good job? And a lot of times what happens in these discussions is they look at it and they say, well, maybe we've made a little bit of progress, but a real problem is marketing the city. We need to package it differently. We need to present it differently. And every time I hear that, my instinct is that that's not accurate. Because if you look at the actual data on any level, we are not doing a great job. It doesn't mean we can't do a great job and we're not in the right trajectory to actually build new substance, but we aren't doing a great job as is today. And so that discussion literally had taken place. It's happened many times, but one right the day before. And then the next day this happens. And so that's why we spoke up, which is look at the data, put it front and center, and stop rationalizing it.
Yeah. So you as a leader, you as a part of the tech companies that have really sort of trying to transform the city of St. Louis, let's talk about the data. You know, as well as anybody, you show me a good statistician, I'll show you a good liar, right? I mean, what are the stats? How bad is it? And is it as bad as people say? Or is it, manipulated? What's going on downtown?
So usually the rationalization happens around the city-county separation.
Right.
The city-county separation in St. Louis happened in 1876. That was a long time ago. Early in the 1900s is when people started to track more of this type of data around crime activity, such as homicide rates. If you look at our homicide rate from the early 1900s to now, we're a 4x from that period of time. Now the population's different because in 1904-ish, we were, somewhere in the 500 to 600,000 range in the city for population. We peaked in and around 750,000, somewhere around there. But our crime has continued to increase over this period of time per 100,000, which is the index that they use for homicide rates. So at that period of time in early 1900s to now in the city alone, leave everything else aside, we're about a 4x. And that's a baseline problem if you actually look at it.
What do you mean by 4x? Explain that to two people.
So there's a rate where they essentially look at how many homicides happen per 100,000 people.
So we're 4 times today than we were.
We're 4 times today than what we were in the early 1900s.
How is that affecting your business? Is that affecting your business to recruit people, to grow, and to expand here in St. Louis?
Well, I just lost an employee. So it affected us very personally. But outside of that, as a business community, having crime that is above the national average is not acceptable.
Are the leaders doing enough in the city of St. Louis?
I don't believe the leaders are stepping up to own the data. We talk about the data, but we rationalize the data. What we need to do, and when I say that, I would include myself in that bucket, which is as the private sector and as the public sector, if we look at stats, I don't just talk about crime on its own. I talk about the economy all the time. So I've done presentations before called World's Fair to World Tech Leaders, St. Louis the next 100 years. And then there I actually give a presentation of our economy and our population over a historic period of time to show that we're still not doing what we want to be. We're 20th in terms of population, metro area, 60th urban core. Our GMP is 21st, so that's gross metropolitan product. It's 21st in the country. So when we look at these stats, we look back and then we'll say, okay, well, we're doing a good job here, here, and here, and that's good enough. What I want us to do as leaders in the city is to first take the data and own the data. In the private sector, this would never be acceptable. If I showed up to a board meeting and I ignored what we would call our KPIs, your key performance indicators, very basic stats that talk about the health of your company, if I ignored those and then just gave a marketing narrative, I'd be fired on the spot.
So you're saying there's no way to even begin to solve this problem because we don't even know how bad the problem is. Because the data, we don't have the data.
I think we intuitively know how bad the problem is. We have the data, we don't own the data. So the data gets reported, but we don't put it up front and center and just say this is what it is. What I would like to see is literally this on the top, take an embeddable widget with the stats and put it on the top of every single St. Louis-based website. Say, here's what we are trying to fix. Here's why we exist. Because if you take those core stats, then you figure out how you actually fit into the equation. So if you are looking at educational opportunities within our youth, what is the point of that? If you're creating better educational opportunity paths, for example, in our underserved areas, the point is to look at assets that are underutilized and not only treat them with human respect, but allow them to contribute back into our economy and society itself. Now, if those are said, then you have to have a way to measure that. Part of that is looking at things like your GMP, looking at health of your economy. Related to that, there's a high correlation a lot of times between poverty and crime. So a lot of these things are intertwined, and that's really what I'm saying is don't just have the data and put it off somewhere else where we don't really talk about it much, or when we do talk about it, we rationalize and say, well, we're doing a good job, let's spend it.
Since you have gone public with this, any reaction that you've gotten?
An enormous amount of reaction. A lot of the private messages from leaders in the city have agreed that we should take a baseline to own the data and then figure out what is next. So I have actually been pretty surprised and impressed with the number of people that have stepped up.
That's Gabe Lozano with LockerDome. People want to reach out to you. Can they get a hold of you?
Gabe@LockerDome.com.
Gabe@LockerDome.com. Can't get any easier than that. Gabe, you're always welcome here. Thanks for checking in.
Thank you.
720.